The fluorescent lights of Sacred Heart Hospital buzz like electric insects as Danielle Ross pushes through the staff entrance at 10:41 p.m., her badge clipped to scrubs that hang loose on a frame designed for tactical gear, not comfort. 8 months of night shifts have taught her how to move through these corridors like smoke, present but unremarkable, competent but invisible, the kind of nurse that residents ask for help with but never quite learn her first name. Her jacket, navy blue and worn soft at the cuffs, hangs on the locker. She'll open in exactly 3 minutes, and inside that lining, sewn with stitches only she can feel, is the MARSOC unit patch that the Pentagon ordered her to bury along with Senior Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross herself. The antiseptic smell hits her nostrils like it does every shift, that chemical burn that never quite fades, mixed tonight with the metallic ghost of someone's blood from the trauma bay downstairs. She smelled worse. Much worse. The memory tries to surface and she pushes it down the way she's learned to push everything down, the way 8 months of careful anonymity has taught her. The ICU corridor stretches ahead, fluorescent panels casting everything in that hospital white that makes everyone look equally ill, and Danielle adjusts her grip on the shift binder she carries like a shield. Her locker opens with a soft click. The cracked mug reading "World's Best Mom" sits on the upper shelf beside a dying succulent, its leaves the color of old paper. She doesn't look at either one. Instead, she reaches for her stethoscope and lets her fingers brush the jacket lining as she hangs it on the hook, a gesture so small, so practiced, that it looks like nothing. Just a nurse straightening her things. Just someone about to start another night of 12 hours pushing medication carts and checking vitals and existing in the margins of other people's emergencies. Her fingers find the patch in the darkness of the lining, the embroidered insignia of Charlie Company, 1st MARSOC Battalion, and she touches it the way other people touch religious medals. The way other people pray. Night shift, Ms. Ross. The voice belongs to Janet, one of the charge nurses, already moving past with a stack of charts and the particular exhaustion of someone who's been here since 7 a.m. Danielle nods once, doesn't smile, closes her locker with the kind of quiet precision that makes no sound at all. This is what she does now. This is who she is now. A nurse with no history, no context, no past that extends further back than August of last year when she materialized at Sacred Heart's HR office with a social security number and references that checked out perfectly because they were perfectly fabricated. The supply room at 2:14 a.m. is dimly lit, rows of medication bottles catching the light from a single overhead fixture that flickers in a rhythm only Danielle notices. She's counting controlled substances, oxycodone, morphine, fentanyl patches, her hands moving through the motions with the kind of precision that comes from 8 years counting similar inventories under battlefield conditions, sorting life-saving medication in the dust and chaos of a combat aid station where every grain mattered. Her hands are trembling slightly as she moves down the row, and it's not from fear. It's from exhaustion. It's from holding herself together for 8 solid months without letting anyone see the fractures underneath. The bottle of 2 milligrams morphine ampules gets logged. Then the fentanyl vials. She writes the numbers in the ledger with careful, deliberate handwriting, each digit a small act of control in a life that has been systematically stripped of control. The Pentagon had called her broken. The letter from General Marcus Webb had called her son dead. And Danielle had called herself nothing at all because the alternative was to scream. Impressive accuracy. The voice behind her doesn't startle her because Danielle Ross doesn't startle anymore, not in any way that shows. She turns slowly, the pill bottle still in her right hand, her eyes downcast in the way she's learned to keep them when superiors are present. Dr. Sterling stands in the doorway of the supply room, his white coat pristine at 2:15 in the morning, his posture the kind of perfect that only comes from never doubting his place in the room. He's observing her with the focused attention of a predator identifying a weakness. "Just counting stock, Doctor," Danielle says quietly, her voice the shape of someone apologizing for existing. "Shift requirements." But Dr. Sterling isn't looking at her words. He's looking at the way she'd counted those bottles without referencing the computer system once, the way she'd verified each serial number against the controlled substance log with the kind of precision that goes beyond nursing school. He's looking at the angle of her shoulders as she turns, the way her weight is distributed across her feet in a stance that's tactically defensive without being consciously defensive. He's looking at hands that move like they've held lives together before, and something in his expression hardens into recognition of something he can't quite name. "You're very efficient," he says finally, and there's something underneath the compliment that tastes like suspicion. Danielle meets his eyes for exactly 1 second, the amount of time it takes to acknowledge his authority, then looks back down at her work. This is what invisibility feels like from the inside. This is what happens when you've been ordered to disappear and you take the instruction seriously. The memory comes anyway, unwelcome and sharp as shrapnel. She's sitting in General Webb's office at Camp Lejeune, the morning light filtering through Venetian blinds that cast shadows like prison bars across her face. He's holding a letter written in official military language, and his hands are trembling in a way that hers have learned never to tremble. "I regret to inform you," the letter begins, and those words crack the world into before and after. David. Her David. Her son who'd been assigned to Charlie Company, 1st MARSOC Battalion, her son who'd inherited her precision and her stubbornness and her absolute refusal to do anything halfway. Ramadi. Classified operation. Gone dark. Presumed killed in action. The letter had been followed by another letter, this one from a Pentagon official whose name Danielle can no longer remember. Witness protection. Reassignment. Your identity as Senior Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross is hereby deemed a security risk due to the classified nature of the operation. Effective immediately, you are to assume civilian identity and cease all military associations. Any contact with former units, family members, or military personnel will be considered a breach of national security. You may not exist anymore. So she'd become a nurse named Danielle Ross, which wasn't even technically a lie, and she'd moved to Denver where nobody knew her, and she'd pushed down everything that had happened in Ramadi because the Pentagon had ordered her to bury it along with her son. Downstairs in the ICU corridor, a resident named Chen is moving too fast, his eyes on his phone instead of his path, and Danielle sees him coming 6 steps before impact. She doesn't think about it, muscle memory takes over, her body shifting sideways with the kind of fluid lateral precision that belongs in a tactical training scenario, not a hospital hallway. The resident slides past her by inches, still staring at his phone, completely unaware that she's just calculated the trajectory of his movement, predicted his exact line, and removed herself from collision with the kind of spatial awareness that comes from moving through hostile territory. Dr. Sterling is behind her. She doesn't know how long he's been there, but she knows he saw it. "That was remarkably fast," he says quietly, and now there's something different in his voice. Something that sounds like he's starting to solve a puzzle that shouldn't exist. Danielle keeps walking without responding, her jaw tight, her breathing controlled, every single muscle trained into the appearance of normalcy. Room for 47 is dark except for the soft glow of monitors, and Danielle moves through the threshold like she's always belonged here. The patient is asleep, his chest rising and falling in the steady rhythm that means the world is still turning correctly. She checks his vitals with the kind of careful attention that's become automatic: blood pressure, oxygen saturation, heart rate, the numbers that tell a story if you know how to read it. His IV is running clear, his medication scheduled, his chart up to date. Everything is exactly as it should be. But Danielle's hands know something else. Her hands can feel the cardiac rhythm underneath the numbers, can sense the tiny irregularities that the monitors haven't caught yet. Her hands have held lives together in circumstances that would make the residents downstairs weep, and they're telling her that this man, this general officer whose name she doesn't know, whose face in the dark looks like someone who's carried weight, has something wrong inside him that no number on any monitor has caught yet. She adjusts his blanket, her fingers steady now, her breathing even. This is the work. This is what she can do. In a world where she's not allowed to exist, at least she can still save lives. At least she can still do this one thing right. Behind her, in the hallway, Dr. Sterling is still watching. And something in that watching feels like a clock starting. Something in that moment feels like the beginning of an ending she's been running from since Ramadi. The night shift stretches ahead of her like a highway with no destination. Danielle Ross, Senior Chief Petty Officer, Ghost, Invisible Woman, walks back to her assigned patients and tries not to think about what happens when the wrong person starts asking the right questions. What they didn't know was that she was still counting something. Still keeping score. still waiting for the moment when being invisible would no longer be enough. The morning shift change at Sacred Heart felt like a collision of tides. Danielle carried her tray through the cafeteria at 6:51 a.m., yogurt, apple, black coffee, moving with the practiced invisibility that 8 months had taught her. The room hummed with 40 voices, residents comparing cases, nurses plotting break schedules, the fluorescent lights casting everything in that institutional yellow-white that made everyone look slightly sick. Dr. Sterling stood near the serving line, his white coat pressed sharp as a blade, his posture engineered to occupy more space than his body actually required. He saw her coming. She knew he saw her because his jaw tightened and his shoulders squared, the physical preparation of something about to move. He stepped directly into her path. The tray went from her hands to the floor in a single motion, his shoulder into her arm, a casual-looking collision that felt very much like it was planned. The crash was enormous. Yogurt splattered across tile in a pattern like a crime scene. The apple rolled under a table. The coffee cup shattered, the smell of it blooming up sharp and acidic. Conversation stopped. 40 faces turned. "Looks like our mystery nurse has butterfingers," Sterling announced, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who'd already calculated the room's response. He was smiling. The smile was the worst part, genuine, pleased, the expression of a man watching something go exactly according to plan. He raised his voice higher. "I'm taking bets, people. How long does she last? 1 week? I'm saying she won't make it through Friday. Anyone who's actually worked real medicine knows competence when they see it, and whatever this is," he gestured at her, already kneeling to clean the mess, already making herself smaller, invisible. "This ain't it." Laughter rippled through the residents clustered behind him. Not all of them laughed. Most did. Danielle's hands moved across the floor, gathering ceramic shards, her breathing steady as a metronome. One tear escaped. She didn't know it was coming until she felt it track down her cheek. She wiped it away with the back of her hand, the same hand that had held a field dressing against a man's neck while his blood turned her gloves red, that had started a central line in a Humvee doing 80 miles an hour across desert that looked like the surface of Mars. That had held her son's photograph for 2 years without ever tearing it. She stood slowly, the broken pieces gathered in both hands. The cup shards cut into her palm, but she didn't react to that either. She met Sterling's eyes without breaking contact. "I've picked up pieces of better men than you," she said, her voice devastatingly calm, each word placed like a surgical stitch. "In places you couldn't survive." The cafeteria went absolutely silent. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical hum. Someone's beeper chirped and nobody moved to answer it. Sterling's smile didn't fade. It shifted. It became something sharper, more dangerous. He'd underestimated her. She could see it happen in real time, the moment his assessment of the threat recalibrated. He'd expected submission. What he'd found instead was something that moved like steel. "Careful, Ghost," he said quietly, stepping closer so only she could hear. "Insubordination is grounds for termination." She walked past him to the trash bin without responding. Behind her, conversation resumed, but the texture of it had changed. Different now. Uncertain. 2 days later, during afternoon rounds, Sterling threw a patient chart at her feet in front of 6 residents. The paper scattered like something wounded, scattering across tile outside room 312. The chart itself bounced and slid under a gurney. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said, his voice carrying that particular tone of a man reclaiming authority. "You're a nurse, not a doctor. Stop acting like you understand treatment protocols." The resident shifted uncomfortably, sneakers squeaking against floor. One of them, a tall guy from Yale, looked at his shoes. Danielle knelt again, gathering papers with mechanical precision. Her knees knew this position now. She'd learned it. Another tear tracked down her cheek, deliberate this time, she understood. This was what he wanted, visible evidence of breaking. She wiped it slowly, deliberately, then looked up at Sterling while still kneeling, maintaining eye contact as she handed him the reassembled chart. "Yes, "Doctor," she said. But underneath the deference, in the space between those two words, something else lived. Not submission. Survival. The sound of restraint. That afternoon, Sterling cornered her at the nurse's station while she was updating medication logs. The station existed in that narrow channel of exposed desk where she was visible to the entire floor but somehow still felt trapped. He leaned against the counter beside her, coffee in hand, close enough that she could smell the bitterness of it on his breath, the expensive cologne that couldn't quite cover something underneath it. Something like fear. "The ghost," he said loudly, naming her for anyone within 50 feet to hear. Appropriate, right? No history. No skills. No future. You'll disappear and no one will remember you were here. That's what happens to people like you. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to something only she could hear. "I'm watching you, ghost. One mistake and you're done. One mistake and you're finished." Danielle's hands gripped the counter. She felt her knuckles turn white, felt the blood retreat from her fingertips, felt something in her chest want to do violence that would end both their careers. 12 years of combat medical training had taught her what bodies could do to each other. What hands could accomplish when rage took the wheel. She locked it down. One measured breath. "Watch closely, doctor," she said, her voice steady as a trauma surgeon's hands. "You might learn something." The humiliation followed her through every shift like a secondary infection that wouldn't respond to antibiotics. Whispered jokes in supply closets. The nickname spreading like gossip through every ward, the ghost, the ghost, the ghost. Residents mimicking Sterling's dismissive tone during handoff, doing impressions of her mysterious background, placing bets on how much longer she'd last. One resident made a joke about her being a trained assassin that got 3 people laughing until Danielle walked past and they stopped mid-sentence, realizing something in her face had changed. She accepted it all with the same composure, the same tears that came at calculated intervals, the same yes doctors that tasted like ash. Nobody knew what she was doing during the nights. Nobody knew she was reading every file Sterling touched, watching his billing patterns, seeing how the procedures didn't match the diagnoses, how phantom consultations appeared on charts for patients who'd never been transferred. Then, at 4:17 p.m. on a Thursday, a military ambulance arrived at the ER loading bay. A Marine general stepped out on his own feet, refusing the stretcher, but Danielle could see the distress in how he breathed. 3 stars on his shoulder. A chest full of ribbons, some gold, some blue, one with a white stripe that meant Valor. His face was grey with pain. She froze when she saw him through the trauma bay window. This was the man. The one who'd written the letter. The formal condolence that had arrived 6 months after Ramadi, words typed on military letterhead that she'd read 200 times, that she'd memorized the way other people memorized poetry. "Your son David died a hero. He served with distinction. He will be remembered." The letter that had killed something in her that never quite came back to life. The general was admitted to room for 47. Danielle read his chart with hands that wanted to shake but refused the luxury. Marcus Webb, age 58, chest pain radiating to left shoulder, shortness of breath for 4 hours, recent respiratory infection. She saw the 3 stars and understood immediately that Sterling would take the case personally. Cardiac work on a general meant billing codes that would light up like Christmas trees. Meant procedures that could be justified, extended, repeated. Meant money. When she entered his room to run the initial assessment, their eyes met. For just a moment, his military composure slipped. Recognition flickered across his face like lightning through clouds. He knew who she was. Somehow, impossibly, he recognized her. Not from a photograph, there were no photographs. Not from intelligence reports, she wasn't supposed to exist anymore. But something in how she moved, how she held herself, some behavioral pattern that combat veterans recognized in each other the way animals recognized each other in tall grass. He said quietly, pain evident in his breathing but something else underneath it. Relief, maybe. Good to see you. She understood without further words. He knew. He would keep the secret. Dr. Sterling took over the general's care at 5:33 p.m., reviewing the initial workup with the expression of someone calculating potential revenue. Danielle watched from the hallway as he dismissed Webb's worsening symptoms, the shortness of breath, the chest pain that was changing character, as anxiety, reassurance, something that time would resolve. But Danielle saw what Sterling couldn't or wouldn't see. She saw the distended neck veins that shouldn't be that distended. The heart sounds that were muffled in a very specific way. The pattern of something building around his heart, fluid accumulating in the pericardial space, pressure increasing with each breath. Cardiac tamponade developing. A killing condition that moved like quiet water, visible only if you knew exactly where to look. She waited until Sterling finished rounds, then approached him at the medication cart with every ounce of deference she'd learned to wear like a second skin. "Doctor," she said carefully. The general's presenting with Beck's triad. Distended neck veins, muffled heart sounds, hypertension. "We should call cardiothoracic." His face hardened. The shift was immediate and violent, like a door slamming. "The ghost thinks she can diagnose now." His voice was quiet enough that only she could hear it. "Get back to your station before I write you up for insubordination. Last warning." Danielle nodded, acknowledged, disappeared back into the machinery of the ward. But that night, during her shift, she did something that might end her career if discovered. She smuggled extra monitoring equipment into Webb's room, a second pulse oximeter, an additional cardiac monitor, equipment that would have set off alarms in the supply system if anyone had been looking. During her rounds, when the hallway was empty, when Sterling was in his office, when the night shift had settled into the quiet that comes after midnight, she checked on the general. He gripped her wrist weakly when she entered. "Your boy," he said, breathing careful and controlled despite obvious pain. "David. He talked about you every day. Talked about how tough you were. Best combat medic the Marines ever saw. He was proud of you. You know that." Her composure fractured. Just for a moment. Just enough for one tear to escape before she locked it back down, wiped her eyes, and returned to checking his vitals. The fluid was building. She could see it on the monitor, the pressure increasing, the cardiac output beginning to fail. At midnight, while Sterling was in his office, she checked his computer. He'd left it unlocked, a rookie mistake from someone so certain of his power that he'd stopped believing consequences applied to him. The billing codes were right there on the screen, phantom procedures logged and invoiced, procedures that had never happened, consultations that existed only in spreadsheets. She saw the pattern immediately, 40% revenue inflation across the cardiac department. A systematic fraud scheme built on the bodies of people like General Webb. She heard him before she saw him. Boots on tile. When she realized Sterling was in the doorway, she had 3 seconds to choose whether to close the laptop or leave it open. 3 seconds to decide if confrontation was better than invisibility. She cleared her throat. Sterling jerked his head up from his billing software and went completely still. For a moment they regarded each other across the space of the office, the ghost and the man who'd invented her. His hand moved toward the laptop. He slammed it closed with barely concealed panic. "What are you doing here, ghost?" His voice had changed completely. The arrogance was gone. Underneath it lived something sharp and desperate. "This is a restricted area." Danielle understood in that instant why he wanted her gone so badly. It had nothing to do with her nursing skills. It had everything to do with the fact that she actually read the charts. That her combat medical training meant she caught discrepancies, noticed when procedures didn't match reality, saw patterns that the rest of the staff simply accepted because they trusted the system. She was a threat not because she was incompetent. She was a threat because she was competent enough to see exactly what he'd built and understand what it meant. "Just checking the schedule, doctor," she said quietly, and left. The ambulance arrived at Sacred Heart's emergency bay at 4:07 p.m. on a Wednesday, and Danielle heard the sirens cutting through the hospital's afternoon rhythm like something demanding the world stop and listen. She was restocking the crash cart on 3 North when the intercom crackled. "Incoming trauma, Trauma Bay 2, Marine General Marcus Webb, age 58, acute chest pain, shortness of breath, ETA 2 minutes. The words hit her like a physical force. She gripped the edge of the cart. Her jaw clenched once. Twice. She pulled a measured breath through her nose and kept moving, muscle memory carrying her hands as her mind fractured into 1,000 impossible pieces. General Marcus Webb. The man who'd written the letter. The man who'd sat in her apartment 3 years ago in full dress uniform, combat boots polished to mirrors, and told her in a voice steady as a surgeon's hand that her son David had died leading a patrol into Sanjin Valley, that he'd died a hero, that he'd saved 14 Marines and she should be proud. She'd memorized every word of that letter. Read it until the paper wore thin. Read it until she couldn't read anymore. She was at the trauma bay doors before the ambulance rolled in. Her uniform was perfect. Her face was neutral. Her hands were steady. The doors burst open and there he was, older, thinner, but unmistakably Webb. The Marine general with 3 stars on his dress uniform and a chest full of ribbons that told the story of a life spent bleeding for something larger than himself. His face was grey with pain. His breathing was shallow, labored. His left hand clutched his chest. Danielle moved into the bay without hesitation. General Webb, I'm Senior Chief Petty Officer, she caught herself. I'm Nurse Ross. We're going to take good care of you, sir. The words came out calm. Professional. Like she hadn't just watched a ghost walk into her hospital. Like the man in front of her hadn't carried the weight of her son's death across 3 continents and deposited it at her doorstep. His eyes met hers for just a fraction of a second, and she saw the flicker of something, recognition, maybe, or just the confusion of a dying man searching for a face that doesn't exist in his current moment. Dr. Sterling appeared in the doorway before the general's stretcher had fully cleared the ambulance ramp. He moved with the fluid confidence of a man who'd built an empire on other people's suffering and called it healthcare. His eyes moved across General Webb's chart like a predator assessing prey. What Sterling saw was not a human being. He saw a Marine general with 3-star authority, a man who'd commanded thousands, a man whose case would justify extended ICU stays, multiple specialist consultations, advanced imaging, possibly a cardiothoracic team he could bill at premium rates while subtly preventing them from actually solving the problem. Sterling saw money. Danielle saw him calculate it in real time. General Webb, Sterling said, his voice smooth as oiled brass. I'm Dr. Anthony Sterling, attending physician. We're going to run some tests, get you comfortable. He glanced at the EKG tech already placing electrodes across the general's chest. Let's get a baseline troponin, CKMB, and BNP. Full chest panel. He didn't order a cardiothoracic consult. That was the calculation right there, visible in the omission like a knife stroke. Not yet. Not until they documented sufficient billing hours in the ICU. Not until they'd maximized the justification for keeping him longer. Danielle watched Sterling's mouth move and understood exactly what his silence meant. The EKG printed. Sterling reviewed it with the kind of theatrical concern that had nothing to do with medical care and everything to do with creating a record. Significant ST elevation in the anterolateral leads, he said, loud enough for the nurses and residents to hear. Possible anterior MI. Webb, we're going to keep you under close observation, potentially in our cardiac ICU. Intensive monitoring. He looked at Danielle. I want Nurse Ross on his case for the night shift. She has strong attention to detail. The words were a weapon disguised as a compliment. What he meant was, keep her close. Keep her controlled. Make sure she doesn't call in outside cardiology and complicate my billing structure. Danielle understood. She'd read Sterling's file, not officially, but a Marine combat medic learns to read files. She knew his department billing had increased 38% in 18 months while mortality rate stayed flat. She knew 3 board members on the hospital's finance committee had personal accounts that benefited from his expanded ICU census. She knew he'd buried 2 malpractice complaints through legal intimidation and 1 settlement that was sealed so completely the victim's name was erased from the hospital's records. She knew he was dangerous not because he was loud or aggressive, but because he was strategic. Careful. Patient. What Sterling didn't know was that she was all three as well. General Webb was transferred to room 447 on the cardiac step-down unit by 4:52 p.m. His wife had died 5 years ago. He had no children. He had no one to call. Danielle reviewed his admission paperwork and saw the blank emergency contact line like a prophecy. She prepared his room with the precision of someone who'd set up aid stations in Ramadi with artillery falling close enough to shake dust from the ceiling. Cardiac monitor. Oxygen delivery. For access at 2 sites. The crash cart positioned within 3 steps. At 6:15 p.m., she performed the initial assessment. Blood pressure 148/92. Heart rate 106. Oxygen saturation 91% despite the face mask delivering 6 liters. She placed her hands on his chest to assess his cardiac impulse and felt the irregular pounding beneath her palms, the chaos of a heart in distress. She'd learned to read living bodies the way other people read books, knew what every flutter meant, what every irregular beat was saying, what every shallow breath was confessing. "General," she said quietly, her voice dropping into the register she used only when the stakes were measured in lives. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. When did the chest pain start?" He looked at her for a long moment. Really looked. The kind of look a soldier gives another soldier when something unspoken passes between them, recognition of training, of sacrifice, of having held something precious while watching it slip away. 2 hours ago, he said. Sharp. Like a fist clenched inside my ribs. Any shortness of breath before that? Any symptoms yesterday? Last week? No. This came fast. He paused. You sound military. Former, Danielle said, which was technically true if you didn't count the ways the military never actually released you, the ways it lived in your bones and your hands and your decision-making. You're going to be fine, sir. I promise. Dr. Sterling appeared in the doorway at 6:48 p.m. He stood there for 30 seconds, just long enough to watch Danielle place a fresh for line with the kind of precision that spoke to years of training beyond what any civilian nursing program could teach. His eyes narrowed. She didn't look at him. She didn't acknowledge his presence. Her hands continued their work, securing the 4 with tape, checking the flow rate, adjusting the monitor leads to get a cleaner signal. Everything stable, Nurse Ross. Sterling's voice carried a question that wasn't really a question. General Webb is resting, Danielle said flatly. Vital signs unchanged. I've documented baseline assessments. Sterling nodded once. But what that single nod contained was calculation. He'd seen something. The way she moved. The way her hands knew what to do without hesitation. The intimacy of her professional care. The suggestion that she and the general occupied the same language. Wrong. Dangerous. A complication in need of management. He left without another word. Danielle continued her work. She checked the monitor. Checked the 4. Checked everything twice, not because protocol required it but because a Marine general with an acute coronary event and a physician actively preventing him from seeing cardiology might be dead by morning. That's what the silence meant. That's what the absence of a specialist consult was screaming. She would not let that happen. But that wasn't the worst part, not yet. Not until Sterling made his next move, the one that would force her into a choice she'd spent 8 months avoiding, stay invisible or save the man who delivered the news that killed her son. But that wasn't the worst part. Not yet. The monitor's rhythm flatlined at 2:04 a.m. Not into silence, into chaos. The beat became a shriek, became a wail, and the sound of it punched through the 4th floor of Sacred Heart like a mortar round. Danielle was already moving before the alarm finished its first cycle, muscle memory taking over, her hands finding their way through the dark corridor toward room 447 where General Marcus Webb lay gasping like a fish pulled from water. His skin had turned the color of old parchment. His fingernails were blue. His breath came in wet, ragged pulls that moved nothing in his chest, the classic presentation of a heart being strangled by its own fluids. Cardiac tamponade. Blood filling the pericardial sac, the membrane surrounding the heart, compressing it with every beat until the organ could no longer function. A surgical emergency. A death sentence without immediate intervention. She burst through Webb's door to find him sitting upright, clawing at his chest as if he could claw his way out of his own body. His blood pressure monitor read 68/40 and falling. His oxygen saturation was dropping like a stone, 92, 88, 84. His heart sounds had vanished, muffled to complete silence beneath the fluid pressure, like listening for a drowning man underwater. "General, I'm here. Stay with me." Her voice dropped an octave, the battlefield coming back into her chest like muscle memory returning from the dead. She moved toward the crash cart, her hands already calculating trajectory and angle, already knowing what needed to happen. Dr. Sterling was there in 90 seconds. Of course he was. The night shift was his kingdom, and he didn't tolerate surprises. "Step away from that cart." Not a request. Sterling's voice came like a whip. "His pericardial sac is full. He's in tamponade." Danielle didn't turn around. Her eye stayed on Webb's face, watching the seconds count down in the blue creeping across his lips. "We need cardiothoracic here now. I'm calling the on-call surgeon. I'm calling no one." Sterling's hand landed on her shoulder like a stone. "You're terminated, by the way. Security's on their way. As for the general, we stabilize vitals and wait for morning rounds. Extended ICU stay, full cardiac workup, justifies extended monitoring and he'll be dead in 4 minutes. Then he'll be dead." Sterling's fingers dug in. "I'm not authorizing any invasive procedure until my consultant clears it. That's policy. That's protocol. And frankly, Ghost, it's above your pay grade. Which is now 0, since you're fired." The machine was speaking to her in numbers now. Webb's blood pressure, 62/38. O2 sat, 79. Heart rate 144 and climbing, a rhythm that had nowhere left to go. His pupils were dilating. His mouth was opening and closing like a fish suffocating in air. In 4 minutes, his heart would stop. In 6, he'd be clinically dead. In 10, he'd be actually dead, and Sterling would file a report saying it was natural causes, write his billing codes for the extended stay that never came, and move on to the next patient he could squeeze for profit. Webb's eyes found hers across the chaos of the room. Found them and held them. His hand came up in a gesture so small, so precise, it was almost military. The gesture of a man giving an order. The gesture of a commanding officer saying, "Do it." She didn't ask permission. She didn't hesitate. She didn't look back. Danielle moved to the crash cart like a linebacker through a secondary, her body sliding between Sterling and the supplies with a kind of controlled force that didn't quite touch him but made clear that it could. Her hands found an 18-gauge needle with the precision of someone who'd done this in darkness, in dust storms, in the wreckage of an aid station in Ramadi where the power died and the enemy fire didn't stop and she'd kept people breathing anyway. "You do this and you'll never work medicine again." Sterling's voice became a shriek. "Security! Security!" She cleaned Webb's skin with an alcohol prep, that cold astringent smell filling the space between them, and positioned him supine at a 45-degree angle. The needle felt light in her hand. Substantial. Right. She located the left xiphocostal angle, marked the path in her mind, felt for the landmarks beneath his ribs the way a safecracker feels for tumblers. "Senior Chief," Webb gasped. 2 words. 1 breath. She inserted the needle at the left xiphocostal angle and advanced it toward his left shoulder at a 45-degree angle, her touch gentle and absolute, a hand that had held lives together in places where gravity tried to separate them. The pericardial sac had a specific resistance, a particular give. She felt it the moment the needle kissed that membrane, a pressure that released the instant she broke through. The blood came out dark and viscous. 60 cubic centimeters. The amount of a child's fist. The amount of a man's life. Webb's color changed first. The gray became pink. The gasping became breathing. His blood pressure read 78/48 and climbing. His oxygen saturation rose like a dawn, 84, 88, 92, 97. His heart sounds returned, faint at first, then strong, then steady. Sinus rhythm. The most beautiful sound in medicine. The sound of death deciding not to come today. Sterling's face turned purple. Not red. Purple. The color of someone whose entire world was collapsing in real time, whose skin was bleeding out faster than the general's pericardium. "What did you do?" His voice cracked. Actually cracked. "My job." "You just committed career suicide." Sterling was dialing before the words finished. His fingers were shaking. "I'm calling the licensing board. I'm calling the state medical examiner's office. I'm calling every attorney who owes me a favor. You practiced medicine without authorization. You performed a procedure outside your scope. You operated without physician oversight. You're done. Finished. There won't be a hospital in the country that hires you." Security arrived 60 seconds later, 2 officers in Navy uniforms, looking confused because protocol said remove nurse, but their eyes said that nurse just saved his life. They escorted her from the room anyway, Sterling's voice following like a predator's growl, "Get her out of my hospital. Now." By 3:15 a.m., Sterling had assembled his full network through a series of phone calls that left no fingerprints. 3 board members who had benefited from his inflated departmental numbers, who received phantom consulting fees for procedures that never happened. The chief of staff who owed Sterling favors from that time Sterling covered for him during his own malpractice settlement. An outside investigator Sterling had personally selected and funded, whose hiring had happened because Sterling knew the man would see things Sterling's way. By 4:48 a.m., he had filed an incident report describing Danielle as dangerously unstable and potentially mentally ill. By 4:30, he had requested her immediate termination for practicing medicine without licensure. By 5:15, he had filed a complaint with the Colorado Board of Nursing, demanding her license be suspended pending investigation. By 6:53 a.m., Danielle Ross was standing in rain that felt like applause, clutching a cardboard box to her chest at the corner of Spee and Downing, 3 blocks from Sacred Heart Hospital. The box held everything she owned that mattered, the cracked mug reading "World's Best Mom" that David had given her from the hospital gift shop when he was 7 years old and didn't know he wasn't supposed to spend his allowance on his mother. The dying succulent from her apartment windowsill, brown and withered and hanging on anyway. The photo of David in dress blues, the only physical proof she'd had a life before the military erased her from the records. Rain soaked through her jacket to the unit patch sewn inside the lining, the faded emblem of her MARSOC team, the only piece of her past she'd been allowed to keep. Her fingers brushed it the way someone touches a scar. Memory and loss held in cotton and thread. She closed her eyes and let the rain find her face. 8 months. She'd lasted 8 months at Sacred Heart before her own competence became a liability. Before someone looked at her hands and saw what they could do. Before saving a life cost her everything. But that wasn't the worst part. Not yet. Because somewhere in the city, a dying man was waking up in a hospital bed with his heart no longer compressed by its own fluids. Somewhere across Denver, a young Marine was getting a phone call he didn't expect. Somewhere in a command headquarters, people who had written her off as dead were pulling classified files and realizing what they'd done. The rain kept falling. The box stayed dry because she held it like it was made of crystal. And Danielle Ross, Senior Chief Petty Officer, Combat Medic, Disappeared Person, kept walking, because that was what she did. She kept moving. She kept surviving. She kept breathing when the world stopped. By dawn, the rain hadn't stopped. It fell sideways against the bus shelter, hammered the plexiglass like accusation, and Danielle stood beneath it clutching a cardboard box that held everything the military had allowed her to keep. A cracked mug. World's Best Mom written in David's 3rd grade handwriting, the letters uneven and beautiful and devastating. A dying succulent she'd watered every morning for 8 months, its leaves paper thin, barely holding to life. A photograph of David in his dress blues, his smile the only proof she'd ever had a life before the military erased her. Before orders came down through classified channels, Senior Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross no longer exists. Your son is dead. Report to Sacred Heart in Denver and disappear into night shifts and scrubs and the kind of anonymity that tastes like copper. She didn't look up when a car passed. Didn't shift her weight or show that her hands were trembling. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. 8 months of holding it down, holding it in, holding everything together while Sterling dismantled her with his voice and his charts and his casual cruelty in cafeterias. 8 months of accepting that some people saw only weakness in a woman who carried a unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, the only piece of her MARSOC team she'd been allowed to keep. 18 thread hours of stitching, done at 0300 in the barracks by her own hands, because she couldn't let that piece of them disappear. Couldn't let every trace of who she'd been turned to smoke. Now she stood in the rain at a bus stop in Denver with a box and a job termination notice and an eviction warning taped to her apartment door. The medical board had moved fast. Practicing outside her scope. Performing procedures without authorization. Dr. Sterling had activated his network at 0600, 3 board members who'd been inflating department revenue alongside him, a chief of staff who'd signed off on 40% billing increases without blinking, and an outside investigator Sterling had personally selected, the kind of investigator who asked no questions when checks cleared. 5 hours. That's how long it took for the entire structure of her disappearance to collapse into nothing. She pressed the edge of the cardboard box against her chest and felt the unit patch through her jacket, the one piece of evidence that she'd existed, that she'd served, that somewhere in the classified filing systems of a Pentagon office, her name was written in gold ink on paperwork no civilian would ever see. The patch was there. The mug was there. The photo of David. A sound cut through the rain. Not a siren. Not a car. The sound of rotors chopping air into submission, the specific mechanical percussion of a Black Hawk helicopter descending through the Denver morning with the kind of authority that made rain seem secondary. Then another. Then a third. The rotor wash hit the bus shelter hard enough to rattle the plexiglass. Danielle didn't flinch. She watched the 3 aircraft descend towards Sacred Heart's rooftop 2 blocks away, their movements precise, coordinated, the kind of coordination that only happened when someone had called in military assets the way civilians called in parking enforcement. Someone had called in military assets. A Marine security detail poured out of the hospital entrance like water finding its level, their movements sharp enough to cut, their uniforms so crisp they looked ironed with purpose. They moved through the corridors, she could see it happening through the hospital's glass walls, moving with the terrifying fluid precision of apex predators searching for something specific. She watched them from the bus stop in the rain, still holding her cardboard box, and understood what was happening in the moment before it happened. They were looking for her. And they knew her name. She didn't know how. Didn't know why. Didn't know that a Marine general with a healed cardiac tamponade had spent 48 hours with the FBI and NCIS, didn't know that he'd recognized her technique with that needle, the way she'd moved, the way she'd breathed, the way she'd held his life in her hands without flinching, and said her name out loud to men who cleared it through classified channels. She just knew that somewhere in her sparse apartment, someone was going to knock on her door. She walked. Not ran. Danielle Ross didn't run from anything. She moved with purpose through Denver rain that tasted like the Gulf and diesel exhaust and something that might have been hope if hope was terrifying. The stairs up to her apartment felt longer than they had when she climbed them at 0700 after double shifts. Her hand was steady on the railing, the hand that had held instruments and syringe plungers and the pulse of a Marine general who lived because she'd broken every protocol in a system designed to protect her by keeping her invisible. She set the cardboard box on her kitchen counter, next to bills she couldn't pay and eviction notices with fonts that looked like screaming. She pressed her fingers against the unit patch one final time, feeling the uneven stitching, the way David had pulled the thread through with the precision of someone who understood that some things needed to hold. The knock came exactly when she'd calculated. 3 sharp raps. Military rhythm. The kind of knock that didn't ask permission. She opened the door and there was her son. David stood in full dress uniform, blues, not combat fatigues, the uniform reserved for ceremonies and salutes and the kind of moments that turned mountains into and hills, and he was alive. Walking. Whole. His shoulder boards carried the insignia of a Marine captain, and his face was her face, strong and clear and the same color as the desert that had supposedly killed him. He looked like he'd been pulled from every classified file and given permission to breathe. "Senior Chief," he said, and his voice was her voice, measured and precise. "They told me you were dead." Danielle didn't move. The trembling wasn't fear. It wasn't hope either. It was the sound of 7 years of silence breaking open. "General Webb recognized the way you held that needle," David said. "Said only one person in the world moved like that. Said only one person would risk everything to save a stranger wearing stars." She stepped back. Let him inside. Watched him close the door with the kind of deliberation that suggested he understood this wasn't a social visit. This was an extraction. This was the military coming to collect its dead and finding them alive instead. At Sacred Heart, General Marcus Webb sat in a conference room adjacent to the executive suite, the same suite where Sterling had filed his termination order hours earlier. His chest was healed. The pericardiocentesis had drawn 60 cubic centimeters of blood from around his heart, and Danielle's hands had held the needle steady while his sinus rhythm climbed back toward stability. His eyes were sharp as a hawk's now, and in them lived the weight of 2 facts, that a woman classified as deceased had saved his life, and that a doctor with financial motivation had attempted to let him die. Webb held a file folder, declassified, the redactions bleached white as bone. His voice shook as he read her citations. Mission Ramadi. Crumbling aid station. 11 hours. Alone. She held the perimeter with nothing but a field medical bag and resolve that apparently transcended the boundaries of classified operations. Bronze Star, Webb read, and paused. The room was silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights overhead, that particular hospital fluorescence that made everything look slightly dead. Silver Star, he continued, and someone in the room, a SEAL team leader with a face like carved granite, straightened enough that Danielle heard his spine align. 2 Purple Hearts, Webb said. His hands trembled. Navy Cross. The SEAL stepped forward. His voice came out at parade ground volume, the kind of volume that didn't need projection because it carried authority through the air like a physical thing. Senior Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross. Each word fell like a boot heel. Navy Cross. 2 Silver Stars. Purple Heart. She trained half the combat medics who saved my men. Every life my team brought home was because this woman taught them to stay calm under fire, to think in chaos, to save the savable and account for their decisions. She trained warriors. And the Army, the Navy, the entire medical establishment buried her in a file and called her dead. The FBI agent beside Webb turned. His suit was federal issue, the kind that hung on soldiers trying to blend into civilian infrastructure. His face contained the weight of 48 hours of excavation, digging through classified files and security footage and Sterling's attempts to delete everything that could trace his interference. "Dr. Sterling," the agent said, and Sterling wasn't there. Sterling was never going to be there again, but the agent's words followed him anyway, through Sacred Heart's corridors and into the legal machinery that had already begun consuming him whole. James Chen. Hospital IT specialist. Marine Corps veteran. He preserved every frame. Every deletion. Every alteration to a patient record. "You're under arrest for healthcare fraud and attempted negligent homicide." Sterling's face had gone grey when the subpoenas arrived. Grey when the 3 board members resigned within hours, their knowledge of the billing scheme, 40% revenue inflation across 18 months, $2.3 million in phantom procedures traced through his personal terminal, suddenly very exposable. Grey when the Chief of Staff's emails were released, revealing he'd approved suspicious codes in exchange for Sterling covering a malpractice incident. Grey when the outside investigators' consulting fees turned out to have originated from the fraudulent revenue stream. By midday, Sterling's medical license was suspended. By evening, his attorney was negotiating. By midnight, security footage proved he'd physically blocked Danielle from treating Webb. Audio recordings captured his order to wait until morning to justify extended ICU stay, and Chen's IT logs showed Sterling had attempted to delete 17 separate video files documenting his interference. Nurses came forward with stories of pressure to upcode, to extend stays unnecessarily, to bill for treatments never performed. His wife filed for divorce. His daughter changed her name. The hospital's internal investigation revealed his pattern extended far beyond Webb. Dozens of cardiac patients received delayed or unnecessary treatments to maximize billing, and at least 6 experienced complications directly traceable to his deliberate interference. 2 years later, David sent his mother a photograph. In it, Dr. Sterling stood in a community center basement teaching CPR basics to high school students for minimum wage. His face was gaunt. His expensive watch was gone. The only medical work his settlement permitted him was teaching chest compressions on a donated mannequin to teenagers who didn't know his name, didn't know he'd once held the power to ruin lives, didn't know that beneath the fluorescent lights of that basement, he was a warning in human form. In the same photograph's background, barely visible on the wall, hung a poster, Danielle in her senior chief uniform above the words "Heroes Among Us." Sterling taught CPR in the shadow of the woman he'd tried to destroy, a monument to the principle that some people are erased by their choices while others are revealed by them. Meanwhile, Danielle stood in the Pentagon beside the Secretary of Defense as her senior chief insignia was formally restored, her DD-214 corrected, her Navy Cross presented in a ceremony attended by the 43 Marines she'd saved in Ramadi. Sacred Heart's emergency department was renamed the Senior Chief Danielle Ross Trauma Center. A bronze plaque in the lobby read, "In honor of a warrior who never stopped serving." General Webb's voice carried across the dedication ceremony, strong and clear after full cardiac recovery. This woman was erased from official records, humiliated by a man who saw only weakness, and chose to risk everything rather than let a patient die. That is the definition of a warrior. Danielle took the podium in her dress uniform, her son David standing at attention beside her, and spoke the closing line that became her legend: "You do not need a badge or a gun to be a warrior. You need only the courage to stand when others won't." The dying succulent now thrived on the windowsill of her new office at the VA hospital, where she directed combat medic training. Beside it sat her cracked World's Best Mom mug, accompanied now by David's photograph, alive, proud, saluting. James Chen received a commendation from the FBI and a promotion to Hospital Security Director, where he implemented systems ensuring no doctor ever again compromised patient care for profit. The light through her office window caught the unit patch she'd finally been allowed to frame, no longer hidden, no longer ashamed, no longer erased. If you've made it this far, you know there are warriors walking among us who nobody sees until the moment they decide to be seen. Subscribe for more stories of the classified heroes who shaped America, and comment, what would you do if everything you sacrificed was finally recognized?